Picture a girl of 15 sitting across a dinner table from a man she has never seen before in her life. She does not know his name until her mother whispers it to her moments before he arrives. She is not allowed to speak unless spoken to. She will not have a private conversation with him until after the wedding. And within a year, she will be his wife, living in his house, bound by law to obey him in every matter that affects her daily existence. Her opinion was never requested. Her consent was assumed. Her future was arranged over letters exchanged between two families who treated her less like a person and more like a valuable piece of property that needed to be transferred carefully so as not to lose its worth. This was not the exception in Victorian England. This was the rule. And understanding why it happened, how it was justified, and what it cost the women who lived through it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the way power has always operated when it wants to look respectable. To understand Victorian arranged marriage, you first need to understand Victorian property law because the two cannot be separated. When a woman married in the 19th century, she ceased to exist as a legal person. This is not a metaphor. It is a precise legal description of what happened under the doctrine of coverture, which had roots in English common law going back centuries. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was absorbed entirely into that of her husband. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue anyone in court or be sued independently. She could not keep her own wages if she was among the working-class women who earned them. Everything she owned before the wedding, everything she might inherit, everything she might earn in the future belonged to her husband from the moment she said her vows. She did not transfer her property to him. She ceased, in the eyes of the law, to be a person capable of owning anything at all. This legal reality shaped the entire logic of Victorian marriage from its foundation. Marriage was not primarily about love or companionship, although those things might emerge over time if a couple was fortunate enough to be compatible. Marriage was a legal transaction, an economic merger, a property arrangement dressed in white fabric in religious ceremony. And because it was fundamentally a transaction, it was handled the way all transactions were handled, by the people who controlled the relevant assets. That meant fathers, brothers, uncles, and the family patriarchs who sat on one side of the negotiating table and decided what terms were acceptable. The girl herself was both the asset being transferred and almost entirely irrelevant to the negotiations about her own transfer. Her feelings, her preferences, her fears, and her private hopes were not considered part of the relevant data. What mattered was her social position, her family reputation, her physical health as a signal of reproductive potential, her properly trained and modest demeanor as evidence that she would be manageable, and whatever financial contribution her family could provide in the form of a dowry. A girl who brought all of these things to the table was considered an excellent match. A girl who had strong feelings about any of it was considered a complication. The machinery of Victorian matchmaking was elaborate and remarkably formal at the upper levels of society. The London season, which ran roughly from May through August each year, was essentially a marriage market operating beneath the surface of a social calendar. Balls, dinners, garden parties, afternoon calls, and presentations at court all served the dual function of entertainment and matrimonial display. A girl who had been formally presented at court and who moved through the season successfully was a girl whose family was signaling to the wider marriage market that she was available, suitable, and ready to be acquired. The costs of participating in the season were staggering, which meant that this particular form of arranged marriage was largely a phenomenon of the wealthy. But the underlying logic filtered down through every class of Victorian society. Working-class families arranged marriages for their daughters through different mechanisms, through neighbors and local matchmakers, through church communities, through the networks of whatever trade the father worked in. The specific rituals changed with income. The fundamental structure did not. Girls at every level of Victorian society were expected to marry whomever their families judged appropriate. And the expectation of genuine personal choice was a luxury that most Victorian women simply did not possess. What is particularly striking about the Victorian discourse around arranged marriage is how thoroughly it disguised itself as something more benign. Few people in the 19th century would have openly described what they were doing as forcing girls to marry strangers. The language used was softer and more comfortable. People talked about parents knowing best, about the inexperience of young women and the dangers of romantic attachment formed without proper guidance. They talked about marrying well as though this phrase described a purely practical wisdom offered entirely for the daughter's benefit, rather than a mechanism of family control dressed up in the language of care. Mothers who guided their daughters towards suitable matches genuinely believed in many cases that they were acting out of love. And they were, in a sense, they were acting out of love for their daughters within a system that offered those daughters almost no alternatives, which made compliance look like protection rather than coercion. The sentimental literature aimed at young women during this period performed a critical function in maintaining this system. Novels, magazines, and conduct manuals were full of stories in which a sensible heroine overcame an initial aversion to a husband chosen for her, only to discover that her family had been right all along, that the man they selected was worthy and good, and that her own romantic impulses had been immature and foolish. These stories were not neutral entertainment. They were ideology in narrative form, designed to train young women to distrust their own judgment about the most consequential decision of their lives and to defer instead to the authority of parents and social convention. They worked by making obedience feel like wisdom and desire feel like weakness. A girl who accepted her parents' choice was demonstrating maturity. A girl who resisted was demonstrating exactly the kind of emotional unreliability that proved she needed to be guided. The emotional reality behind this narrative was often considerably darker than the story suggested. Letters and diaries from Victorian women describe the experience of being presented with a prospective husband as producing a particular mixture of anxiety, resignation, and carefully managed hope. Many women wrote about meeting their future husbands only a handful of times before the engagement was formally announced, of having almost no opportunity to assess the real character or temperament of the man they were about to be legally bound to for life. Some described a kind of emotional numbness that settled over them during the engagement period, a deliberate dampening of feeling that was the only rational response to a situation in which feeling things deeply was potentially dangerous because you had absolutely no power to act on what you felt. Hope was permitted in small, controlled doses. Expectation was not. The consequences of this system for women who ended up in incompatible or abusive marriages were devastating, and they were entirely predictable from the structure of the system itself. Divorce in the Victorian era was expensive, shameful, legally complicated, and socially catastrophic. Until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, divorce required an act of Parliament, which meant it was available only to the very wealthy, and even then only under the most extreme circumstances. After 1857, civil divorce became theoretically accessible to a broader population, but the standards applied to women seeking divorce were radically different from those applied to men. A man could divorce his wife for adultery alone. A woman had to prove adultery combined with an additional offense such as cruelty, desertion, incest, or bigamy. The law was not designed to help women escape bad marriages. It was designed to keep them in marriages regardless of conditions, because a marriage market depends on the permanence of its transactions. A woman who left her husband without obtaining a legal divorce lost everything. She lost her home, her children, who were legally the property of their father, her social standing, and her means of financial survival in a world where respectable employment for middle-class women barely existed. The alternatives to staying in a marriage were so brutal and so total that most women in deeply unhappy situations simply stayed. They managed. They endured. They found small private spaces of autonomy within a structure that offered almost none. And the fact that so many of them did this without visible protest was then used as evidence that the system was working well, that women were naturally suited to domesticity and wifely submission, that the arranged marriages were in fact producing contentment. The silence of those who had no choice was read as happiness by those who had made the choice for them. There were women who resisted. There were daughters who refused matches their parents had chosen, women who eloped with men they actually loved, writers, and activists who argued publicly that the system was unjust and harmful. But resistance came at an enormous personal cost. A girl who refused a suitable match brought shame onto her family and dramatically reduced her chances of attracting another offer in the future. A woman who eloped with a man her family opposed risked complete social ostracism. A woman who wrote publicly about women's rights was caricatured in the press, dismissed as unfeminine, and ridiculed in the same publications that ran sympathetic stories about the natural happiness of properly arranged marriages. The system had well-developed mechanisms for punishing those who challenged it and for discrediting challenges when they arrived. The reform movement that eventually dismantled the worst legal aspects of the system was slow, contentious, and resisted fiercely at every step by people who argued that changing the legal and social status of women would destroy the family structure, corrupt public morality, and ultimately make women themselves more miserable rather than less. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began to give married women the right to own property independently of their husbands. The expansion of women's education across the second half of the 19th century opened new possibilities for economic independence that had not previously existed. The suffrage movement brought questions about women's legal personhood and political standing to the center of public life in a way that could not be ignored indefinitely. And gradually, across the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, the cultural expectation that a young woman should accept whatever marriage or family arranged began to weaken in ways that were visible in the fiction, in the journalism, and in the behavior of actual women navigating the marriage market. But weakening is not the same as disappearing. The economic pressures that had made arranged marriage seem rational for so many families did not vanish overnight simply because the laws changed. As long as women's employment options remained severely limited and women's wages were a fraction of men's, the underlying logic of securing a good marriage as the primary path to financial security retained its practical force. As long as a woman's social standing depended largely on her husband's position and income, the calculation behind choosing a husband for status over affection continued to influence how families thought about their daughters' futures. The ideology outlasted the most nakedly unjust laws that had embodied it. As ideology almost always does, surviving in customs and expectations and the quiet pressures of family life long after the formal legal structures had been amended. What the Victorian system of arranged marriage and estrangers ultimately reveals is something profound about how social control operates most effectively when it wraps itself in the language of love and protection. The mothers who steered their daughters toward suitable men genuinely believed in most cases that they were serving those daughters' best interests in a dangerous world. The fathers who negotiated marriage settlements were genuinely trying to secure futures for children they loved within an economic system that offered women almost no independent security. The culture that produced romantic novels about girls learning to love their arranged husbands was genuinely invested in the belief that the system produced happiness rather than merely compliance that resembled happiness from a sufficient distance. The story of Victorian girls forced to marry strangers is not ultimately a story about deliberate cruelty or individual villains, though cruelty existed within it, and some individuals wielded the system with genuine callousness. It is a story about a structure so completely embedded in the laws, the economics, the literature, and the daily social practices of an era that the people operating within it could not clearly see its full dimensions. That opacity was not accidental. Systems that depend on the participation of those they constrain are always most stable when those people cannot fully perceive the shape of what is holding them. The Victorian marriage market functioned for as long as it did because the girls being moved through it were trained from childhood to believe that what was being done to them was natural, inevitable, and ultimately a form of care. The moment that belief began to crack widely enough, the system began the long, slow, and still incomplete process of changing into something else. That process is worth understanding not only as history, but as a map of how every similar system, in every era, eventually reaches the same moment of fracture.